I'm John Little, and this is the ShockCast.
Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down, 220 feet. 15 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
What you are about to listen to, in one sense, is something that has been years in the making. For years, I have wondered at how Afghanistan could be the source of 93% of the world's heroin. I just couldn't understand how the U.S. Air Force could completely control the airspace of Afghanistan while thousands of square miles of opium poppies were under cultivation. We could see those poppy fields from the air and could have sprayed them with any of the massively potent herbicides at our disposal, but we didn't. Why? We had satellites that monitored everything that went on in Afghanistan, along with everything that went in and out of Afghanistan. There was seemingly no way that so much heroin could actually be leaving such a remote, landlocked country that was under the complete control of the United States military. How was any of this possible? Why was no one talking about this? The streets of America and Europe are filled, overflowing with heroin. In fact, there's so much of it that it's actually cheaper than similar prescription opioids. Yet we are doing nothing about the source of this problem. Nothing. When you see what a huge and potent problem can be and when you see a huge and potent problem that can be solved cheaply and easily, you know that you're looking at something really bad when no one's doing anything. And I suspected that the source of the problem was the CIA, but suspicion doesn't reach certainty until you can fit enough pieces together to see the bigger picture and see how it began. This vast criminal empire began with something that some of us also knew about, Operation Gladio. But it's something to know. It's one thing to know about an operation. It's something entirely different to track down its origins and see how it got its funding. This tracking process is why this week's series was initially called Gladio. But you'll notice that I don't really call it Gladio anymore. It's now all about the vast criminal empire created by the Central Intelligence Agency. And as I moved through the steps of figuring out how this empire developed, the picture got clearer and clearer and clearer. So walk with me now through the process of untangling the twisted origins of the greatest criminal empire in the history of mankind. Okay, we're diving in. And I'm only doing this because Operation Gladio represents a snapshot of what governments and organizations become when you give them power, money, and secrecy. Any two of those is bad. All three together are catastrophic. The core of the problem isn't an ism like communism, fascism, or the fervent belief in lasagna. It's not an ideology or even philosophy. It's not even religion or the lack of one. The problem is that we human beings are awful. Then you won't find books examining proven conspiracies from the light of our human awfulness. We don't like looking closely at how awful we are. Anyone who says that they know everything that there is to know about Gladio and the many stay-behind armies created by NATO is probably lying to you. Intelligence operations are heavily compartmentalized, so much so that even those in leadership often know only a small part, if anything, of the details. And we only know about the Italian version of these groups because they screwed up. Mistakes were made within the Italian stay-behind army, and too many people talked. Eventually, the knowledge of Gladio became far too public, and Giulio Andreotti, Prime Minister of Italy, revealed the existence of this above top-secret organization in Italy, and it was called Operation Gladio. What is a stay-behind army? Well, after World War II, it was believed that the Soviet Union was interested in conquering the rest of Europe. That's why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed 4 years after the end of World War II. Since NATO was not confident that they could stop a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, they created secret stockpiles of weapons and ammunition so that resistance groups behind enemy lines could cause as much trouble for the Soviets as possible to slow them down while the West struggled to push back the invasion. This worked well against the Germans during World War II, and NATO hoped that an even more organized resistance organization would work even better. It was a good idea. The problem was that these stay-behind armies that we generally refer to now as Gladio became subverted. And their subversion started out with something a bit like good intentions. The Soviets were giving aid to socialist and communist movements in Western Europe, and that aid was boosting socialists and communists into positions of power. This alarmed the leaders of NATO, and as the saying goes, if all that you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. Instead of fighting socialism on the battleground of ideas, they chose the path that they knew best: violence. In this case, assassination and false flag attacks to create a fear of socialism in the hearts of the average European. This was a vile and evil thing to do, but it was even worse than that. Intelligence operations cost money, and even the simple task of just gathering intelligence is expensive. Acts of sabotage, assassination, and terrorism cost even more money. And the leaders of Operation Gladio couldn't ask their unsuspecting governments for the cash that they needed to terrorize the public. So they turned to drugs. Tons of heroin came from the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia and hit the streets of Europe and the U.S. Cocaine came from South America, and marijuana, well, it came from everywhere. So on top of the terrorism, you had the scourge of horrifying drugs and destroyed lives. In fact, the drugs were even worse than the violence, and that wasn't the only thing that they did, but we'll leave the details for later. The point that I want to make here is that a good idea was subverted by men who lacked conscience. This good idea was used to stop a minor evil with an even greater evil. Instead of using superior ideas, they used superior force. They also fell prey to an age-old problem. Large, hierarchical, and secretive organizations with access to lots of money will always turn evil. Always. There is literally no exception to this rule in history. You only need to look at the Roman Catholic Church as our biggest example. And the most recent illustration of my point is the whole Russiagate fiasco. And both the Republican and Democratic parties are irredeemably corrupt. And yes, both parties. I believe that the reason why God set up the New Testament church to be small with little hierarchy was for the purpose of keeping our churches from becoming corrupt. Unfortunately, even our best churches have instituted unbiblical hierarchies that have allowed our churches to become bloated and corrupt institutions. God does not like hierarchies in his church, and a hierarchy, a system where there are levels of authority between the bottom and the top, is forbidden by God. We are all equal in the eyes of God, and we should all be equal in the eyes of each other. There should be no hierarchy, no levels of authority in our churches. But that's a discussion for another time. The point is that a good idea went bad because human beings are awful. And in the rest of this series, I plan on showing you what went wrong, how it went wrong, and even why it's not being stopped. More importantly, you need to understand that there are a lot of organizations out there like Operation Gladio, and you can see these organizations when you see them have power, money, and secrecy. That's all it takes for your greatest evils to flourish. As I said yesterday, intelligence operations are expensive. We already know the cost of wars, but very few understand the incredible costs required to maintain intelligence gathering, networks, and engaging in covert operations. Furthermore, governments like to keep their hands clean. They want to be able to say that the assassination of such and so was a complete surprise and none of their doing. This is part of why intelligence organizations like to have secret sources of income so that they can operate freely without having to justify their actions. Oh, and there's this very interesting phrase, follow the money. You find some very interesting people when you do that. Before jumping into what the title talks about, I would like to go off on a bit of a tangent. Just a few hours after posting my first article and a video about Gladio, I saw this article about something disturbingly similar. The article is called "Extortion by Rogue Police Gangs is Booming in Bolsonaro's Brazil" from Bloomberg. Just as my article and video talked about something created for good that turned completely evil, here is an article about the creation of a security operation tasked with protecting the population that turned into a parasite that was killing the population. Just like Gladio, this security force needed money to fund their operations, so they turned to crime to get that money. Here are 4 paragraphs that I grabbed from the article. Quote, "Militias, bands of rogue and off-duty police and other security officers started operating in Rio's impoverished western neighborhoods a few decades ago. Politicians either turned a blind eye or collaborated with the groups which were ostensibly formed to drive out drug traffickers, but mutated into mafia that charged for services such as security, cooking gas, internet access, and cable TV. These gangs are now active across Rio and 14 other cities in the state, affecting the lives of 2 million people, police say." And then in another paragraph, "The militia operates an extensive protection racket that with fees ranging from $5 a month for a small house to $375 for large businesses. Recently, it expanded into illegally developing land, selling and smuggling cigarettes, which offer rich profits and lesser criminal penalties than drugs." And then police say militia members have infiltrated the mayor's office and employment agency. Armed, hooded men frequent the job center, according to 2 Itaboraí residents who requested anonymity for fear of reprisals. The militia demands a cut of workers' salaries for employment, the people said. The rise of militias over the oil business is very worrisome, says Helvio Rebescini, an executive at Plural, a fuel distribution association. There are militias operating a growing number of illegal gas stations, and Petrobras has been a victim of growing oil theft on its oil pipelines. Close quote. Brazil wanted to get rid of the illegal drugs that were flooding the streets of Brazil. The police weren't big enough or strong enough to solve the problem by themselves, so they turned to militias. The militias reduced the amount of heroin and cocaine on the streets of Brazil, but they then became yet another problem that Brazil can't handle. Oh, and where did the drugs come from? The article doesn't say, but the conclusion of this video will tell you exactly where those drugs come from. So, let's get to that Chinese heroin. And no, we won't be completely talked, but anyway, moving on. It pains me to say this, but it looks like China deserves to be conquered by Mao Zedong. And I'm not completely sure that I can blame Chiang Kai-shek. Some blame Chiang enthusiastically, others claim that he was unable to control the warlords that were his generals, and both sides in the discussion have an axe to grind. So I can't be completely certain which is true, but one thing is very, very clear. Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Party, or KMT, was selling heroin to the United States. The irony is that Chiang Kai-shek actually made opioid abuse illegal in China and imposed draconian punishments upon addicts, and especially on those selling the drugs. Those laws carried over to Taiwan, where being caught selling heroin was an automatic death sentence until recently. But someone somewhere in the KMT, way back before they were kicked out of China, had a nice deal going with the Green Circles gang, who was distributing heroin. It was sort of like Nixon's war on drugs. On the one hand, you had the DEA putting small-time dealers and users into prison, while the CIA was running heroin out of the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And no, I don't know if Nixon knew about what the CIA was doing. Well, after the communists launched their revolution in 1927, the government, led by the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek, needed money to fight the communists, and when you are engaged in a civil war, gathering taxes is difficult. So they sold opium. By the way, what's the difference between a civil war and a revolution? You call it a revolution when you win. Just saying. Anyway, opium and then heroin was being used by the KMT to get enough money to beat Mao's communists. And as the KMT kept losing battles, they kept being pushed south, and even further south. Eventually, they wound up being split in two. The biggest part of the KMT was in Taiwan. The other, and you can guess where they would wind up, in what would become known as the Golden Triangle. If you don't know what the Golden Triangle is, it's the mountainous area alongside the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Burma, now called Myanmar, associated with the production of that heroin that we've been talking about. And it was that part of the KMT, under the command of General Lee Mi, that created the Golden Triangle after they lost to the communists, by growing opium and converting it into heroin. Who was shipping out the heroin? The CIA. They brought in weapons and materials via C-46 and C-47 transport planes and brought out heroin in their return flights. Where was that heroin going? Well, let me ask you a question. A different one. When did America have her heroin epidemics? Well, they say that there have been 3 of them in the latter half of the 20th century, but actually the past 70 years has been one long heroin epidemic. And I think that you can figure out where that heroin was coming from during the early years of this epidemic and who was bringing it in. It was the Chinese heroin from China that started the epidemic, and it was KMT heroin from the Golden Triangle that kept the epidemic going. Oh, and again, CIA airplanes were flying all that heroin into the US and everywhere else in the world. Now, this might seem just a little incredible to you right at this moment. It's hard to believe that the CIA would do something like this. But let me offer a fact that will help you verify everything that I'm saying. Remember that the Golden Triangle was the #1 producer of heroin until, and you'll probably guess, until after the American invasion of Afghanistan. That's right. After the American invasion of Afghanistan, the top producer of heroin switched from the Golden Triangle to the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan. And about 90% of all the heroin on the streets of the world comes from Afghanistan. How did it get out of Afghanistan? Well, I could leave it for you to guess, but let me help you think this through. Afghanistan is a landlocked country, so ships are out. You could drive it out by truck, but there aren't many roads out of Afghanistan, and all of them are heavily monitored and controlled. Then there's the venerable donkey. Oh yes, the donkey. Journalists love to weave tales of donkeys laden with barrels of poppy juice, trudging over the tortuous Hindu Kush mountains into Pakistan. Right. Tens of thousands of tons of poppy juice shipped out by donkey. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. Furthermore, we already know how the heroin is getting out of Afghanistan via U.S. cargo planes, CIA cargo planes. Now, how else are you going to get 2,500 tons of heroin out of Afghanistan? And yes, every year, 2,500 tons. Remember that it takes many tons of poppy juice to get a ton of heroin. Again, it's a landlocked country and the U.S. controls the air. I think that you can do the math. I already have. The point that you need to get is that the CIA and the OSS before it has been distributing heroin throughout the world from China, then the Golden Triangle, and then from Afghanistan for more than 70 years. They made trillions of dollars during those 7 decades, and they shipped thousands of tons of heroin around the world every year and destroyed the lives of millions upon millions of people and wrecked whole countries. I'm just sorry that the history of Taiwan is stained by having had a role in this drug trade. The Taiwanese people themselves had no role. They didn't even want the KMT when they arrived on this island, and the current government certainly didn't have a role in this drug trade. But Chiang Kai-shek, either he or someone under him definitely had a huge role, and he didn't break off ties with General Lee in the Golden Triangle when he should have known what Lee was doing. I find it hard to believe that Chiang didn't know. He was not a stupid man. I just hate the thought that he was part of this. Anyway, please understand that there could never have been a heroin epidemic without the CIA. They caused this epidemic. They made it as bad as they could possibly make it to make as much money as they could possibly make. And they used at least some of that money to fund Gladio. And they started with Chinese heroin. To think that the CIA is directly responsible for the heroin on our streets is shocking to contemplate. But it's even more so when you realize just how much money they must have accumulated. They made trillions of dollars. They had to share a lot of that money around, but they had to have received a huge share of it. Think also of the power that they must wield because of all that money. Think of the criminal networks that they had to protect to keep the money and heroin flowing. Think of the assistance that they had to have received from someone or something. Yesterday, I made the connection between the CIA and the heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia. Today, I want to dig deeper into that idea. It's public knowledge that the CIA was built upon and around a corps of German Nazi SS intelligence officers under General Reinhard Galen. The CIA was new and desperately needed experienced operatives, and they couldn't trust a lot of the spies that had been in the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Too many of the OSS officers were sympathetic to old Uncle Joe Stalin and his Soviet Russia. So the founders of the CIA turned to the Nazi intelligence officers that they brought in via Operation Paperclip. So it should be clear to everyone that the CIA was evil from its very beginning. So when I realized that the CIA raked in trillions of dollars running heroin to Europe and the US, I wasn't surprised, even though it's pretty still shocking to think about. The question in my mind is this: what did they do with all that money? You can bet that they used a lot of it to maintain operations like Gladio. After all, it was one of the reasons why they got into the heroin business in the first place. They also used that money to keep politicians from looking too closely at what they were doing. And the rumors of dirty tricks are everywhere if you look hard enough. And who did they share the money with? When that much money is flowing through your hands, it draws attention. More importantly, the CIA needed partners to help get the heroin onto the streets. They needed partners to keep their airplanes from being searched. They needed partners to launder their money. And those partners would have wanted their own cut. Their very first partners would have been the Mafia. The Mafia had already established a relationship with the OSS and the U.S. military by helping with the invasion of Italy during World War II as the Allies were trying to defeat the Nazis. So the Mafia and other organized crime syndicates would have been extremely useful in getting the heroin onto the street so that it could be sold. The CIA shipped the heroin in and the Mafia sold it. But what do you do with the money once you have it? If that money doesn't make its way into the global banking system, it's worthless. So they needed someone to help them with all of that money, and they knew who that someone would have been. Allen Dulles. Allen may have been the third director of the CIA, but he was far more important than that. He and his brother John Foster Dulles helped found the CIA, and they also had deep connections to Wall Street. Oh, and Allen had another great connection: the Jesuits. John Foster Dulles had a son, Avery, who became a Jesuit priest beginning in 1946 before eventually reaching the level of cardinal in 2001. Avery himself was probably not all that influential in his own right, but Avery might have provided a conduit for communication and influence with the Jesuits of the Roman Catholic Church. And there are some indications that there were Vatican connections to the CIA and Operation Gladio. Vatican Bank connections. Then I suppose that those Vatican connections could have been trusted more than the Wall Street connections. I'm not sure. There are also indications that banks were set up with the purpose of pumping vast amounts of money through them before letting them fail. The list of those banks is long. BCCI is one of them, for those of you who remember that scandal. Now, put yourself in the place of Allen Dulles. He had just become the director of the CIA in 1953 after his brother, the newly appointed Secretary of State, put him there. He was the first veteran intelligence officer to lead the organization. The previous two directors had been high-ranking military officers, and the CIA had already suffered a string of failures. Also, the CIA was in an adversarial relationship with Congress. What to do? Oh, and consider the distinct possibility, or actually probability, that Allen Dulles had no conscience whatsoever. He certainly didn't exhibit any conscience in his efforts to bring in the Nazis via Operation Paperclip, and some have indicated that he was probably a psychopath, or at least highly sociopathic. So dishonorable and unethical behavior would have probably not have been a problem for him. He needed a big source of money, and he got it through something called Civil Air Transport, an aviation company created by Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers fame. Civil Air Transport, or CAT, eventually became Air America in 1959, but the name doesn't really matter. What mattered was that CAT had access to the Golden Triangle. General Lee of the KMT forces along the Chinese border had created an airstrip, and CAT had already been given the task of supplying the KMT forces with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. So when did Allen decide to fill all those CIA transport planes with heroin on their return journeys? Of course, I'm blaming Allen for this. The CIA could have been doing this from the very beginning. Claire Chennault himself might have been running drugs, but I don't like Allen Dulles very much, and so I'm happy to keep blaming him, and I believe that I have cause to do so. Anyway, this was the first of many operations that the CIA would engage in over the decades, where they would supply the drug producers with weapons in return for tons of narcotics. The CAT planes took weapons into the Golden Triangle and brought heroin out. The next question that I have is whether Allen set things up so that any and all successors to his position as DCI would not know what was happening. Would he have trusted any future director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or DCI, to actually carry on with his operation? Was he making money himself in this drug running through his Wall Street connections? I suspect that Allen did embed his self-funding drug-running operation deep within the CIA to either hide it from future directors or to make it impossible to eliminate. Intelligence organizations like the CIA already employ highly compartmentalized operations, so this would have just been another even more compartmentalized operation than most. Whatever did happen, only a very few CIA people would have known that they were running drugs from the Golden Triangle into the United States and Europe. The other possibility is that the CIA always made sure that any future director could never or would never reveal what was really happening. There is a lot that is hard to know. Whatever the case, too much money was being made for anyone to ever be allowed to threaten this heroin operation, and we have far too many accounts floating around of people knowing too much and winding up dead. And this drug running operation currently runs far too well, and no one seems to ask about where all the drugs are coming from and how they get there. Could it be that people who ask too many questions meet untimely deaths? What you need to keep in mind is that the heroin operations of the CIA are very efficient, and no one has been able to stop them. They have made trillions upon trillions of dollars and corrupted the U.S. federal government in the process. It is one of the most vile and evil of America's sins, and it's a sin that no one seems to know about. And I'm reminded of this phrase from Revelation 18. Quote, "For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived." Close quote. Revelation 18:23b. I used to think that this was the Vatican, but the more that I see that it has been the CIA who has engaged in pharmakeia, or sorceries, the more that I wonder about New York City or Washington, D.C., or even America as a whole. Is Revelation 18 speaking about the United States? Or some part of it? Remember that no one on planet Earth is a bigger drug runner than the United States via the CIA and the Wall Street banks. Also, no one does more pornography. No one corrupts the world with their delicious movies like the United States does. In fact, the amounts of evil coming from this once great and good nation is choking. Maybe that is why God refers to her as a harlot. The woman who rides the beast might be called a harlot because she was good before turning towards prostitution. Or I could be barking up the wrong tree. I've done it before. Just remember, when you hear about someone falling prey to heroin, that it was the CIA that is ultimately responsible. They did it. And one day, I hope to see them pay the price for it. The truth about what America created is almost unimaginable. But only almost. If we did not know about other CIA evils, we would dismiss what we are seeing here as just the fevered imagination of an overheated mind. Even so, the horror of what has been done is hard to face. But the cost of ignoring the truth is far too high. So, we must face this. We must also realize that God is just and his judgment for these evils will not be withheld for long. Evil has a price, and it must always be paid in full. I don't think that there are many articles that I have written that are as painful to write as the one that I wrote here. It took me 2 hours of pacing the floor and doing the unnecessary before I could even get myself to make the few mouse clicks that would launch the blank page upon which I wrote. It just is so awful that my soul cries out at the evil that has been done in our name. Paul said to Timothy that the love of money is the root of all evil, and this despicable chapter in America's history is proof of that statement in ways that few could ever have imagined. It is monstrous, a monstrous evil that makes the book of Revelation seem like an obvious result. Who could blame God for destroying so much of the earth when you realize just how evil our governments have been? Of course, you and I know that God is just, so we weren't going to blame God for anything anyway. But to see such a big reason, well, the destruction of Revelation makes complete and utter sense, and this is just one of many, many evils that we are guilty of. However, I didn't come here to talk about God's wrath, but to speak of One of the causes of that wrath, and I've known about CIA involvement in the heroin trade for a long time, the CIA connection to the heroin coming out of Afghanistan cannot be denied. It is impossible that there would be so many other reasons that there would be any other reason than more than 3,000 tons of Afghani heroin are hitting the streets of North America and Europe every year. And only a pitiful amount of it is seized by anti-narcotics police. The CIA connection is the only reason why this trade is so successful. They are able to deflect attention to the source of the trade and the transportation network that delivers it. They are able to deflect attention from the distribution network where heroin-laden transport planes arrive at their destinations. The deafening silence over all this screams of CIA involvement. There is literally no one else that could have done this, and longtime readers have seen me grumble over this for years. And then, a couple of weeks ago, I stumbled over this article, Operation Gladio, the Unholy Alliance, between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia, overview of the book by Paul L. Williams. That book review is written by Anthony C. Black, and you can find the link to that article in offguardian.org. And as I said last week, I'm afraid that websites like offguardian.org fail my sanity check every time. And you should never trust people with a mental disease like the one that they have to tell you how the world works. Well, you notice that I'm about to use their Operation Gladio article and go through it because nothing else puts the pieces together so well with so few errors. And yes, we will find errors in this article, but the overall truth is there, and even crazy people will sometimes share valuable facts with you. So let's hold our noses and dive into the cesspool of this article. Note, the website where this article sits has given express permission for anyone to repost the contents of their articles as long as attribution is made. And I did that. So let's start off with the first few paragraphs of this article. Quote, on the hot summer morning of August 2nd, 1980, a massive explosion ripped apart the main waiting room of the Bologna railway station. 85 people were killed and hundreds more injured. Though at first blamed on Italy's legendary urban guerrillas, the Red Brigades, it soon emerged that the attack had in fact originated from within the deep state of the Italian government itself. The full nature of this secret parallel state would only come to light a decade later when the Italian premier, Giulio Andreotti, under questioning from a special commission of inquiry, revealed the existence of arms caches stashed all around the country and which were at the disposal of an organization which later came to be identified as Gladio. The members of this group turned out to include not only hundreds of far-right figures in the intelligence, military, government, media, church, and corporate sectors, but a motley assortment of unreconstructed World War II fascist psychopaths and criminal underworld types to boot. And despite Andreotti's attempts to airbrush the group as patriots, it appeared evident to much of the rest of the Italian polity that these seemed rather more like pretty bad folk indeed. Little did they know, follow-up research by the likes of Daniele Ganser, Claudio Celani, Jürgen Roth, and Heinrich Kruger traced connections to similar groups spread throughout Europe, of which all were found to be deep state terrorist organizations, and all of which were found ultimately to be subservient unto the highest levels of the CIA and NATO command structures. Close quote. One of the reasons why we routinely find out about secret organizations and secret activities is that they routinely screw up. They always overreach, they always grab for more than they can grasp, they always think too highly of themselves and too little of you and me. That bombing was a colossal mistake. They got arrogant and sloppy and blew their cover, literally. And you can bet that most of the Gladio network was forced to disperse and disappear. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at CIA headquarters at Langley while they discussed that debacle. But let's continue on with the article. Quote, "The moniker, Gladio, after the two-edged sword used in classical Rome, was eventually broadened to include a bewildering host of related deep-state terrorist structures, including P2 in Italy, P26 in Switzerland, Sveaborg in Sweden, counter-guerrilla in Turkey, and sheepskin in Greece. This hardly definitive European list was then found to have connections not only to virtually every U.S.-sponsored secret state terrorist organization in the world over, including the likes of Operation Condor in Latin America, but also to the many global drug cartels that provided the secretive wealth needed to fund and otherwise lubricate the whole rotting, corrupt shebang. If all this sounds sinister enough, it pales in light of the detailed structure of the dazzlingly diabolical Gladio edifice." This guy writes interesting. Anyway, and it is to those details we now repair vis-a-vis an overview of the remarkable, if otherwise unheralded, 2015 work by journalist Paul L. Williams entitled Operation Gladio, the Unholy Alliance Between the Vatican, the CIA, and the Mafia. Though there are other books on the subject worthy of honorable mention, including Daniele Ganser's seminal tome, NATO's Secret Armies, and Richard Cottrell's recent and stylishly written Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe, it is to Williams that I believe we owe a particular debt of gratitude in having provided a more or less fully integrated portrait of the global machinations of Operation Gladio." Close quote. I'm afraid that I have far less of a glowing opinion of Paul L. Williams than the writer of this review, this article. Paul appeared on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie and made some statements that I personally knew were untrue. It showed that he plays fast and loose with the difference between causation and correlation. Just because you are in the area of a certain thing and might have had some sympathy for a certain thing doesn't mean that you cause that certain thing. Just saying. I hope that made sense to you, but let's not chase that rabbit and get back to our story. And I can definitely confirm that the next paragraph in the article is true. Quote, "Before embarking on our grim, if yet fascinating journey, it is worth first noting that whilst Gladio was officially acknowledged and condemned by the European Parliament in November 1990, Washington and NATO, having ever after refused comment on the matter, and its multifarious organs and factions ordered dismantled, it is hardly likely that the latter was ever fully enacted." Basically, what he's saying is they never took it apart. The historical context of Gladio then is really the quintessential backdrop to the understanding the trademark false flag events of the modern era. To understanding the trademark false flag events of the modern era. Close quote. What an utterly embarrassing and painful coda for those who ran this operation. I'm not sympathetic to their embarrassment. In fact, I mock them for failing so badly. If you get censured by the European Parliament, you have truly embarrassed yourself completely. Here are the next few paragraphs. Quote, "The general origins of this labyrinthine network of deep state actors lay in the so-called stay-behind army set up at the end of World War II by the Allied powers, principally the U.S., ostensibly to act as resistance forces should the Soviets ever decide to invade Europe. Quickly, however, the raison d'etre of the armies transmogrified into a mission to counteract not external invasion, but internal subversion. Such would eventually result in the undermining not just of post-war European socialism, but of Italian, Greek, and later global democracy itself. But we get ahead of ourselves. The primal author of the Stay Behind Armies, Williams informs us, was General Reinhard Galen, the head of German military intelligence during the Second World War. Having foreseen early on that the Reich was doomed to defeat, Galen had concocted the idea of forming clandestine guerrilla squads composed of Hitler Youth and diehard fascist fanatics, ostensibly to fend off the inevitable Soviet invasion. These guerrilla units he referred to as werewolves. Close quote. It is hard to know if this claim by Williams is accurate. It is certainly plausible that General Galen was the originator of these werewolves. We certainly know that they existed to combat not only the Soviets, but the Allies too. But whether Galen was the origin of the idea or not is relatively unimportant. Someone knew that NATO could not stop the Soviets from invading Europe, should they have chosen to do so. The best that NATO could do at the time was slow the Soviets down until help could arrive from the US and the rest of Europe. The Soviets were always going to win the first battles of any invasion into Europe. And then we move on with the article. Quote, "Not ones to miss a fascist opportunity when they saw it, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, under the leadership of William Wild Bill Donovan, quickly enlisted both Galen and SS General Karl Wolff in 1945, in forming the Galen organization, later to transform into the present-day German BND, and which received its initial funding from U.S. Army G2 intelligence resources. The American point man on this was Allen Dulles, the first president in 1927 of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and later the first head of the CIA. Duly incorporated into the American fold, the werewolves were given that the werewolves were, given that their initial meddling took place in Italy, rebranded as gladiators. Operation Gladio was born." Close quote. Sorry for my difficulty in reading his writing. This is not completely true, by the way. It was Allen Dulles himself who brought in Galen from the cold. Dulles was in Switzerland when Galen offered his services to Dulles in return for immunity from prosecution for he and his group of intelligence officers. And the initial statement, in bold on the written part, in this next paragraph is also incorrect. Quote, "In 1947, the CIA, having that year superseded the OSS, was faced with its first daunting task, i.e., how to prevent the Italian Communist Party, PCI, from forming the next government. Elections were scheduled for 1948, and the PCI was a virtual shoo-in, not just in Italy proper, but in Sicily as well. Fortunately, Gladio was ready and waiting. The gladiators had been training in a special camp set up in Sardinia, under the local command of the former World War II Italian fascist leader, Prince Junio Valerio Borghese." Close quote. Sorry, but the CIA did not supersede the OSS. The Office of Strategic Services was shut down and dispersed. It was no longer a trusted intelligence organization, so it was dissolved on September 20th, 1945. Please remember that America was not used to having civilian intelligence organizations. Intelligence gathering was always a part of the military, and each branch of the military had their own intelligence group and still do. Even when the CIA was created, its first two directors were high-ranking military officers. So for 2 years until the CIA was formed on September 18, 1947, there had been no civilian intelligence agency in operation. All intelligence for that period was being handled by various military intelligence groups. I should say foreign intelligence. We still had the FBI. The rest of the quoted paragraph above sounds credible, as well as the next two. Quote, "In addition, hundreds of American mafioso began to arrive on the shores of Italy to lend a hand with the communist problem. The arrival of the made men was the result of Donovan's efforts from 1943 onward in working with American mobsters Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese to conjure a few drug funding for the OSS's off-the-books operations and to reinstall the Sicilian Mafia on the island in the lead-up to Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. These forces were now unleashed on the Italian electorate, and through 1948, an average of 5 people a week were murdered by the CIA-backed terrorist units. The results were grimly predictable. Hallelujah, the PCI were defeated and the Christian Democrats returned to power. Still, the threat remained. Fully half of the Italian electorate were communist sympathizers, and, moreover, leftist politics pervaded much of the rest of the diseased European body. More would have to be done. The problem, however, was money. There simply wasn't enough of it. Thus, the initial $200 million in funding for Gladio, which had come from the Rockefeller and Mellon foundations, was quickly exhausted, and though the National Security Act of 1947 had provided the loophole that allowed for the CIA's covert operations, it had not allowed for their overt congressional funding. There lay the rub. Thankfully, Paul Halliwell knew how to salve the itch. Close quote. I spent a lot of time as a teenager reading about World War II and studying the strategy and tactics involved. And it is well known that American and British commanders relied heavily on intelligence and help provided by the Mafia in Sicily. In fact, the Mafia had been running their own resistance campaigns against the Germans occupying Sicily. I just find it to be an interesting coincidence that the second director of the CIA, or DCI, was Eisenhower's chief of staff during the Sicilian campaign, Major General Walter Bedell Smith. Were those connections with the Sicilian Mafia his? Do any of us have time to track all of that information down? No, of course not. So, right, moving on. Oh, and that second quoted paragraph proves my point about the cost of intelligence gathering and covert operations. It's expensive. And it's why so many intelligence websites are complete frauds. One of those websites that I despise the most is Debcafile. Giora Shamis is a lying liar and loves to take your money and give you lies in return. Never read Debcafile. Okay, here are the next 2 paragraphs. Quote, Paul Halliwell was an inner member of the original OSS along with key scions of the Morgan, Mellon, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, DuPont, and Ryan families. And according to Williams, likely the greatest unsung hero of the nicknamed Oh-So Social Club for OSS. It was he who, having cut his teeth in the drugs for arms trade by shepherding opium deals with the Kuomintang or Kuomintang, KMT, the Chinese National Army fighting against Mao Zedong, conjured the brilliant inspiration to do the very same thing in the United States itself. Thus, it was at his suggestion that Donovan elected to forge the deep bond and that exists to this day between the nation's intelligence services and organized crime. Enter stage left such notables as Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, and Trafficante, and Gambino crime clans. Quickly, the streets of first New York and later many in American metropolis were flooded with heroin. These early halcyon days would soon lead to the infamous French Connection, thence to the Golden Triangle, where CIA's very own Air America transported drugs out of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, and later to the Balkan, Mexican, and Colombian drug cartels. Close quote. All of that rings true, especially the high society elements of the OSS. Society elites have played a big role in the State Department for almost all of that department's history. It is also hard at times to distinguish between the people working for the CIA and those working for state. Both have drawn heavily from Ivy League universities and elite families for their leadership. The next paragraph brings up a question that I alluded to last time or yesterday. Quote, all very well and good, but to begin with, there was yet a fly in the whole drugs for arms for terror ointment, to wit, how to pay off the mafioso without anyone noticing. Indeed, how to stash, launder, and hide all of this financial daring-do from the prying eyes of the authorities. You know, the real enough authorities, the treasury cops, and so forth. How do you do that? Close quote. That last question in the article is the big one, and there are some interesting paragraphs that provide part of the answer. Quote, and he goes on with the Vatican connection. Article 2 of the Lateran Treaty of 1929 was clear and unequivocal. The article, which served to regulate matters between the Holy See and Italian state, expressly forbade any interference of the latter in the affairs of the former. It is hardly conceivable, of course, that the framers of the treaty ever foresaw what such immunity could actually mean in practice. But then they probably hadn't reckoned on the fiendish formation of the Institute for Works of Religion, or IOR, or more colloquially, the Vatican Bank. Established by Pope Pius XII and Bernardo Nogara in 1942, the bank would quickly come to serve as the principal repository post-war both for the Sicilian Mafia and for the OSS/CIA, wherein all of the monies and the documents relating to drug trafficking and to Gladio would be stored and laundered. Already in 1945, the Pope had held private audiences with Donovan to discuss the implementation of Gladio, and where, as Williams reports, Donovan was knighted as an anti-communist crusader with the Grand Cross of the Order of Sylvester. Prior to this time, Pius XII had proven himself a loyal ally in working with Dulles and the OSS to establish the rat lines used to help prominent Nazis escape Europe. Now new horizons beckoned. The first duty at hand, of course, was to destroy the communist menace in respect of the 1948 elections. To this end, the Pope authorized his own terror squads under Monsignor Bicchieri, can't pronounce it properly, to assist the gladiators and the made men in intimidating the Italian electorate. Task accomplished. The second duty at hand, however, was longer term. Communism, socialism, and indeed any godless form of progressive government anywhere had to be stamped out at source. For this, money would be needed. Lots of money. Untraceable money. Drug money. Now, in the months before the 1948 election, the CIA deposited some $65 million into the Vatican Bank. The source of these monies came from heroin produced by the Italian pharmaceutical giant Schiaparelli, and which was then transported by the Sicilian mob into Cuba, where it was cut and then distributed to New Orleans, Miami, and New York by the Santo Trafficante family. Lucrative though this trade was, it was not nearly enough to suit the needs of the CIA and Gladio. More would be required, more drug networks, and more banks. Gladio was about to go global. Close quote. We have a lot of information easily available that confirms these three paragraphs. It certainly makes sense that they would initially depend upon the Vatican Bank to help distribute the funds for their operation. The next part is where we see the KMT that I talked about last time, where they come in. Quote, to start with, a new alliance was forged with the Corsican Mafia. Unlike the Sicilian mob, the Corsicans had extensive experience in processing heroin, a skill that they had picked up through years of working with Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese technicians in French Indochina. A supply route then emerged running from Burma through Turkey to Beirut and thence to Marseille. Alas, there was a slight hitch when the leftist dockworkers in Marseille, being sympathetic to the rebel army under Ho Chi Minh, refused to load and unload the boats from Indochina. No worries, a deft bit of terror administered by the Corsican boys and funded by the CIA. And the problem was solved. By 1951, then, Marseille had become the center of the Western heroin industry. Voila, the French connection. Meanwhile, Wild Bill Donovan had resigned from the CIA to form World Commerce Corporation, World WCC, whose primary function was to facilitate the arms for drugs deals with the KMT. Paul Halliwell lent a needed hand at the helm by heading up Sea Supply Incorporated, a CIA front company gainfully employed in shipping heroin from Bangkok. In 1958, the whole operation was so successful that a second supply route was established running through Saigon. Here, the help of Ngo Dinh Diem, the U.S.-installed despot of South Vietnam, proved invaluable. Close quote. By the way, he was Catholic, very much so. Remember that the CIA purchased Civil Air Transport, or CAT, from Claire Chennault in 1950. So they had a secure way of getting heroin from the KMT in the Golden Triangle to Bangkok. From there, it was easy to get the heroin to Europe. Remember that the KMT were expert in the manufacture of morphine and heroin, so it makes a lot more sense for the heroin to be manufactured on the spot in the Golden Triangle. But that might be an unwarranted conclusion on my part. This next paragraph is where we see how the CIA started to manage the concealment of their drug running. Quote, "Still, there was a potential cloud on the horizon, i.e., word of all these shenanigans was bound to leak out. What to do? The first reflex, naturally, was to pin the blame for the West's growing heroin problem on the Communist Chinese under Mao Zedong. Check. The second, more considered response was to organize an ongoing campaign to deflect attention away from and burnish the image of the CIA. And to this end, in 1953, did the CIA establish Operation Mockingbird. Under Mockingbird, the agency recruited hundreds of American journalists to spread false stories and propaganda about the company's benign activities. Eventually, this depraved fabric of anti-journalism enlisted entire news networks, including ABC, NBC, Newsweek, Associated Press, and the Saturday Evening Post. I'm losing my mind. Now, the guys and gals at Langley could relax. Henceforth, American and global eyes were dutifully prismed through the rose-colored lens of Mockingbird. Close quote. Remember that there's money involved, lots of it, so capturing the media and then American politicians would have been a major priority. This next paragraph brings us deeper into the Vatican connection and what I hope is a massive typo. Quote, "But back to the Vatican. The IOR, solid banking pillar of the Gladio community that it was, could hardly be expected to do all the heavy lifting itself. After all, the global heroin industry would, by 1980, be pulling in a cool, and here's where I'm hoping the typo is, $400 billion annually. En route to an extensive and orchestrated financial network would be required to supplement God's bank, i.e. the Vatican Bank. As with any fine orchestra, it helps to have a maestro of exquisite genius to run the show. A nice round of applause then for one Michel Sindona. The biography of Sindona begins humbly enough with his degree in tax law from the University of Messina in 1942, after which in quick succession he rockets to stardom as a leading financial advisor to the Sicilian Mafia, an agent for the CIA, and thereafter a financial intimate of the Holy See, meaning the Pope. By the late 1950s, Sindona had become the linchpin in a nexus between the mob, the CIA, and the Vatican that would eventually, as Williams chillingly puts it, result in the toppling of governments, wholesale slaughter, and financial devastation. Close quote. Whoops. We either have a typo, or the writer of this article has lost his mind. Or the situation is so huge that, well, I don't have words to describe it. I'm mentally struggling to see how the CIA was making that much money, $400 billion, from the heroin trade in 1980. $400 billion in 1980 would have been a sizable fraction of the world GDP, which was $11.1 trillion at that time. Was the global heroin industry worth 3.6% of world GDP? To put it into another perspective, the GDP of Italy was about $483 billion in 1980, and depending on how you calculate inflation, 400 billion is about 1.2 trillion today. If you use the more accurate figures published by Shadow Stats, we are closer to 2 trillion in heroin sold in just 1980 alone. 2 trillion. I have seen figures that indicate that the world drug trade today is close to that 3.6% of global GDP figure. But I don't know if we can apply today's figures to 1980. Did the CIA have complete control of the global drug trade in 1980? Was the global drug trade worth 3.6 of global GDP back in 1980? If the answer is yes to both questions, then the CIA is a lot bigger than any of us have ever imagined possible in our worst nightmares. We're talking trillions of dollars made by the CIA. My mind is already blown by what I'm seeing so far, but I'm still struggling to grasp the idea that this much money was flowing through the hands of the CIA every year. So if anyone has any better data on the total value of the heroin and cocaine trade in 1980, please let me know in the comment section. I want verification. But let's get back to looking at the article. In fact, I'll skip over a few paragraphs of minutia to get to these two. Quote, "This points up a general operating procedure of the entire Gladio banking system, i.e. the system, far from being designed to turn a profit, was expressly designed to lose money. That is, to have it siphoned off into covert ops. Such explains the regular and spectacular failure of a host of CIA-related banks, including Franklin National Bank, purchased by Sindona, Castle Bank and Trust, Mercantile Bank and Trust, both set up by the ubiquitous Paul Halliwell, Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, and from which funds were diverted to undermine Prime Minister Gough Whitlam during the Vietnam War, and infamous Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, based in Karachi in aid primarily of the Southeast Asian heroin trade. Indeed, it was precisely the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano itself that brought forth Calvi and Sindona to their untimely ends. Finally, it is worth noting here that these august institutions were linked in a tight criminal embrace with many of the most prestigious financial firms in America, including Citibank, the Bank of New York, and the Bank of Boston. The base of the iceberg, in short, extended far and wide. But then, what was all this money really doing? Close quote. I actually knew a couple of shady characters who had been involved in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. One or two of you might as well. I'm looking at you guys. For one of them, if you shook his hand, you'd want to count your fingers to make sure that you got them all back. And who knows, the two characters I'm referring to might have been lying about their connections. Lying is easy. Anyway, the point is that the CIA was creating banks and then blowing them up, figuratively, when their usefulness was over. But there was this last question that is the most intriguing. But then, what was all this money really doing? Now that is the question. And the next paragraphs of this article don't really answer it, but there is something interesting here. Quote, following the thwarting of Italian democracy in 1948, the Gladio secret armies entered into a period of what one might characterize as pregnant incubation. Thus, it was during the 1950s that various drug supply routes and financial networks were being created, as were some of the principal political organizations. Probably the most important of the latter was Propaganda Due, otherwise known as P2. Created in 1877 as a Freemasonry lodge for the Piedmont nobility, it was banned by Mussolini in 1924, only to be resurrected post-war with the approval of Allen Dulles himself. Or should I say, himself a 33rd degree Mason. The lodge, though at first dominated mainly by spooks, spies, military, and mafia figures, would soon encompass a who's who of Italian political, corporate, banking, and media supremos, to boot. Indeed, the organization would eventually spread shoots throughout Europe as well as North and South America, and its members would come to include such luminaries as Henry Kissinger and General Alexander Haig. Kissinger. A P2 denizen of especial significance was Licio Gelli. The latter's pedigree was impressive. A former volunteer in the 735th Black Shirts or 735th Black Shirts Battalion, a former member of the elite SS division under Field Marshal Goering, and thereafter a chummy employee of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps of the 5th Army, working with William Colby, the OSS agent in France, and Alan Dulles, the OSS director. Gelli soon gained entry into the Vatican, where he helped set up the Nazi escape routes to Argentina. His ties with Argentina would later prove critical in facilitating Operation Condor, the U.S.-backed mass assassination program in the 1970s and 80s South America. Moreover, in 1972, Gelli would emerge as P2's supreme worshipful master, under whose leadership the lodge would reach its full horrific flowering. Finally, it is worth mentioning at this juncture that it was as a result of a police raid on Gelli's villa in 1981 that the full tentacled structure of Gladio would come to light, but we digress. Close quote. Some of you are probably looking for a connection to the Illuminati in all of this. If it's there, you will find it at the Masonic Lodge called P2. It has its fingers deep in a lot of surprising places, and most surprising of all, in the Vatican itself. I've been hearing rumors about this lodge for decades, so I'm sure that there is a lot of very interesting dirt tied into that secret society. The next 8 paragraphs connect Gladio to the horrendous terror campaigns of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're important, but not for our story, so I'm skipping them. This next one might be the most important of all. If the details are actually truthful. Quote, "The high-level intrigue did not stop at the murder of the Prime Minister. However, at least 2 popes felt the sharp end of the Gladio sword as well. In August of 1978, Pope Paul VI died. His successor, the preternaturally timid John Paul I, soon gave his handlers a very real shock when, after looking at the IOR reports, or the Vatican Bank reports, or accounts, I should say, he issued a call for reform. The very next day, the otherwise fastidiously health-conscious pontiff, in office barely a month, was dead. Not just dead, but expired with the telltale bulging eyes and horrific grimace of acute poisoning. His autopsy was definitively thwarted by an illegal and hastily contrived embalming, and his personal papers disappeared without a trace. Archbishop Marcinkus, having been temporarily removed prior, was returned to office, whilst Calvi in Sindona was under scrutiny at the time. Well, they breathed a temporary sigh of relief." Close quote. It should be clear to anyone with more than half a brain that Pope John Paul I was murdered. The only question is, was it really the CIA that did it? Basically, the author is claiming that the CIA controls the Vatican, or at least a large element within the Vatican. I find that assertion hard to believe, but anything is possible when lots of money is flowing through your hands every year. The author compounds the claim with this next paragraph. Quote, "Having been almost burned once, the overseers of Gladio made sure to engineer the follow-up papal succession. Thus did Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, Polish, shuffle on to the historical proscenium as Pope John Paul II. Now, at first, John Paul worked seamlessly with the CIA and Gladio. Together, they oversaw the destruction of liberation theology in Latin America, the continued undermining of Italian democracy, and the dispensing of black funds for solidarity in Poland. But how the best laid plans do oft go astray. By the spring of 1981, not only were events spinning out of control, but Gladio itself. But so too were they for Banco Ambrosiano, and by extension the IOR, or Vatican Bank. The Pope inexplicably refused to act. Compounding this lapse was an unaccountable trifecta of moral turpitude. that witnessed the Holy Father suddenly breaking into treasonous song singing the benefits of the rapprochement with the Soviets, recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and IGAD's nuclear disarmament. The order from on high was given, kill the Pope. Close quote. And when you say Gladio, you are saying the CIA. Yes, other intelligence agencies are involved, but the CIA is the head of them all. Is the CIA really picking popes? To figure out if this is possible, I did a search for how much the Roman Catholic Church is worth. The best answer I could come up with is billions. And I used to believe that billions was enough to answer the following statement. The Catholic Church is the biggest financial power on earth. That's actually a title for the piece that I was looking at. I actually lived most of my life believing that this was true. It's not. I was wrong. After 70 years in the drug trade, the CIA is worth many trillions of dollars. They have complete control of the heroin industry. They own it. They own it so much that no one can so much as talk about it. In comparison, the Roman Catholic Church is only worth billions. That's chump change compared to the CIA. The rest of the article goes on to talk about how Pope John Paul II suffered an attempted assassination, along with the realization of who was behind it. But I think that we've seen enough. Please, think about what all of this means. If the CIA eclipses the biggest financial power on earth, then the darkness at the heart of America is so very much worse that it staggers the imagination. And its name is the Central Intelligence Agency. Oh, and to give you an idea of how important the drug money would be to the CIA, their official annual budget today is less than $20 billion a year. If they are making hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars every year, that official budget is a drop in the bucket by comparison. So, I wonder yet again, what are they doing with the money? Let's bring this to a conclusion. And there's only one conclusion that can be made. The Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America is the biggest criminal empire in the history of the world. There is literally no other conclusion that can be made. As horrifying as that statement may sound, the numbers don't lie, and the facts cannot be avoided. We can argue the details all day long, but the conclusion stays the same. And the ironic part of this was that it started so innocently with Operation Gladio. There's a part of me that can't believe what I'm seeing. I knew for years that something like this was happening. There's no other way for 93% of the world's heroin to originate from Afghanistan when the U.S. controls the airspace and all ports of entry. This just can't happen any other way. However, it's one thing to merely suspect that a thing is true. It is something else to actually see the network that they were using. To see it grow from its infancy, to take its first baby steps, and then launch into the monstrosity that rules so much of the criminal underworld. For the CIA to do this, the amount of control that they must have over the criminal networks around the world must be immense. They also need to control the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Pentagon. They need to control any politician that might have any oversight into their activities. They would need to control the media to make sure that any and all news reports would be deflected from their criminal activities. And they would need to make sure that they maintained this control quietly with complete finesse. Remember that secret operations routinely expose themselves when an important component screws up. That's how we know about Operation Gladio. The Italian arm of these stay-behind armies made stupid mistakes, and the whole operation was revealed. It was a painful lesson for the CIA, but one that they have taken to heart. They have learned how to keep their secret operation secret, and I'm betting that 99% of the official employees of the CIA have no idea that any of this is happening. Remember that the CIA employees are patriots of the first order. They are passionate about their country and its safety. I have friends who were in the CIA and some that still are in that evil organization. They are wonderful Christian brothers who have no idea of the vast evil that the CIA is involved in. And I would trust those men with my life, and you would too if you knew them. But what the CIA is doing is truly monstrous. I doubt that I have done so much as touch even the tip of the iceberg. I have just talked about the heroin trafficking. There's also cocaine. And I've heard numerous reports about their activities there. And those reports offer firm proof that they really are in control of the cocaine business. What else are they involved in? Basically, they are involved in anything that has a gigantic profit margin, and if it makes a huge profit, they are in it. Human trafficking, child pornography, electronic theft. I know someone who had a lot of money stolen from him or her from his bank account, and the bank, for some reason, could not recover the money. That should not have happened. It should not have been possible for them to be unable to recover that money the way it was stolen. Was a criminal arm of the CIA involved? As someone who understands how banks work, it should not have been possible for that money to disappear without a trace the way that it did. But it did disappear, and some of it seemed to disappear into Southeast Asia, if I remember correctly. How much control over the banks does the CIA have? For them to control the heroin trade, they must be able to control the banks. One of the most reliable reports about CIA cocaine trade comes from a helicopter pilot named Gene Chip Tatum, employed by the CIA, who found out that he was running cocaine into Arkansas. Chip did other things for the CIA, and whenever he needed money for a job, all that he had to do was go to a certain bank on Wall Street, and they would give him millions of dollars, if that's what the operation needed, in cash, no questions asked. And the proof that he offers is compelling, even to a cynic like myself. Remember that the banks don't have police powers. They don't have a military. They have no way of protecting themselves from a criminal enterprise like the CIA, which does have police powers and which does have a military. Could the banks hope to survive when faced with something as psychopathic and as powerful as the CIA? Please think this through with me on this. You might think that the banks are all powerful, but all that cash can't stop a bullet, and they know it. Remember also that this criminal enterprise started out within the CIA. They were dealing with a threat from the Soviet Union, and there was nothing that they would not do to stop that threat. And they got the FBI to help with that threat. Do any of you remember that J. Edgar Hoover denied the existence of the Italian Mafia until 1957? Remember that Hoover created the FBI in 1924 and directly ran it until his death in 1971. He was not a stupid man. He knew that the Mafia existed. He knew that the mob existed. He denied both until too many of his own agents saw too much on November 14th, 1957, in Alapachin, New York. Was Hoover owned by the Mafia? Did the CIA own the Mafia? Did the CIA own Hoover? Unfortunately, there's just no way for the CIA's heroin operation to survive this long if they did not own the FBI, the DEA, the NSA, and every other national organization with police powers. And I seriously doubt that the Mafia could have stayed independent from the CIA, since the CIA could have torn the Mafia into little pieces at any moment that they chose to. If you think that I'm overblowing all this, tell me how else the thousands of tons of heroin could be distributed throughout the world without being stopped every year. Also, while you are doing that, explain to me how the U.S. Air Force refuses to spray the 328,000 hectares or 1,266 square miles of opium under cultivation in Afghanistan, and that's just the official figures on how much land is being used to cultivate opium in Afghanistan. You can see the opium flowers from space. You have thousands of square miles of opium poppies under cultivation, and the U.S. Air Force refuses to spray those opium poppies with herbicide. Doesn't that tell you something? It tells me that the U.S. Air Force is under the control of the CIA at the top. Not everyone in the Air Force is under the control of the CIA, just the people at the top, and some of the pilots flying some of the transports. Are you seeing how deep this must go? Again, this started with an operation to help save Europe from a Soviet takeover, and it has morphed into something so big and monstrous that it's hard to know where it begins and where it ends. In fact, it's so huge that it doesn't matter if you and I talk about this. After all, we're just conspiracy theorists. Now, you might think that all of the above is just the reason why I'm talking about this. Most crazed conspiracy theory nuts would stop right there and consider this a job well done. But that's not what this is about. Look at the book of Revelation. Look at the rise of the beast. That is what we are talking about here. And no, I'm not saying that the CIA is the beast, but I believe that it's part of it, or it will be, after Ezekiel's fire. Remember, something glues the world back together after Ezekiel's fire happens. Ezekiel's fire will destroy so much of the world's infrastructure that something or someone will need to put the pieces back together, and whoever does that will wind up in control of what has been reconstituted. They'll rule the world. Who better to do this than the CIA with its vast global criminal networks? Is the CIA the seven-headed red dragon that revives the beast in Revelation 12? I think it's possible, but I don't know. What I do know is that there is a vast network that is working tirelessly to bring us to the days of the coming of the Antichrist, and I would not have seen it for myself if I hadn't grabbed hold of an article on a disreputable website and followed the rabbit hole to its incontrovertible conclusion. It's the last days, and we shouldn't be surprised at how this has turned out. But I can't help but being completely shocked and really upset at what I'm seeing. Hey, you like that video, right? Great. Click like and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. Then go to the next level. Subscribe to The Shock Letter at theshockletter.com and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Now, read my book, Ezekiel's Fire, at ezekielsfire.com. Why? Because Ezekiel's Fire is coming.